So we're here today with Charles Cotton, Senior Policy and Practice Advisor, Pay and Reward with the CIPD. And can I say first, Charles, thank you so much for being the author yet again of the foreword to our reward management textbook. It certainly sets the scene beautifully and is much appreciated.
It's a pleasure, Stephen.
I thought that for our conversation, our reward management conversation today, we could start off by asking you, what are you working on at the moment?
Well, as you said, in my job title, there's two areas. One is around public policy, and the other is around practice. And what does it? So, for instance, commissioning research and thinking, well, what does this mean for reward practice going forward? So, in terms of policy, earlier, I don't know, this year, well, or halfway through the year, we had a general election and a new government, and they've come out of the tracks running with lots of proposals which are going to have a large impact on the world of work. And in that, there are implications around reward. So there is the government is going to change. It has changed the remit of the Low Pay Commission. So going forward, it will have to take into account the cost of living when it's making its recommendations. Similarly, rather having various age ranges for the national minimum and national living wage, there'll just be one adult rate going forward. Though that will probably be phased in over time, so it's not going to be happen straight away. There's also an employment rights bill, and that's going to be looking around things like, in terms of reward, there's big implications are the extension of gender pay gap reporting to ethnicity and disability, that when you produce a gender pay gap report, you'll now have to also produce an action plan to show how you're tackling that gender pay gap and how you're going to, what your ambitions are for going forward. And often it's not just about pay, it can be about, and often is, about organizations, how they recruit and select and promote and develop, and actually it's maybe more around flexible working opportunities than unfair pay practices. And then there's also the extension of the right to equal pay. At the moment it's gender, but going forward it's the proposals are to extend it to ethnicity and disability as well. So that's the kind of the big pay areas. Obviously there are also issues around pensions. So the government has set up a review of pensions. The first stage has been looking at, I suppose, kind of outcomes in terms of how can we improve investments, things like fees. Also, should pension funds be investing more in the UK, especially in startup tech companies, which they see as the future. And the second stage will be focused more around the input. So are people saving enough money for their retirement? So the minimum rate that employers are expected to make into the pension scheme at the moment it's 3%. Should that be increased? Should the age at which people get enrolled be brought down from 22 at the moment down to 18? How pension contributions are calculated, should they change? So at the moment they are based on a band of earnings between the lower earnings limit and the upper earnings limit, and the proposal is that the lower earnings limit should either be abolished or reduced, so that more pension contributions are going in then into pension pots. That said, whilst employers would pay more, the employees would also pay more. So there are cost implications, and will employees be more likely to then opt out because they're seeing their contributions go up a bit? versus the power of behavioral science and inertia. So those are the policy areas. In terms of research, we often do our labour market outlook, which looks at certain issues each quarter. So last quarter, which was around summer, we looked at the national minimum wage as well as the voluntary living wage, or what's called the real living wage. And we've done some analysis, and that will be produced in the next coming weeks, looking at why organisations have joined, have become accredited, and why they're seeking accreditation, as well as why organisations perhaps don't want to become voluntary living wage, well, not just not being accredited employers, but not benchmarking themselves and just paying what other, what the voluntary living wage is. And of course, you've got other issues going on, and you're probably aware that equal pay is a big issue at the moment. So we've had recently the judgment in Next. We've got ASDA, and we've got loads of other well-known retail and supermarkets chains going through the court cases. It's been going on for a long time, and I'm sure it will carry on for a number of years as well, because various things are going to be appealed. But what are the implications there? And similarly, you've got other issues that are outside the UK but are beginning to have an impact. So, for instance, both in the States, you've seen a growth in states within the USA introducing pay transparency requirements, especially around job adverts, and banning questions about pay history. In Europe, we are also about to see the Transparency Directive being implemented by member states, which again will require organisations to put information in pay adverts, as well as carrying out equal pay audits on a regular basis. And if there is a certain sized gap, then the employer and the unions will have to get together and work out how they're going to tackle that gap. So lots of things that are on my agenda at the moment.
Certainly, you sound as though you have, yes, your agenda very, very full. Looking ahead, we've got a budget coming up at the end of October 2024. Any things that you're thinking about? Are there any things that, from a policy point of view, the CIPD are trying to influence?
Well, everything really. So, for instance, I mean, it's not necessarily my area. It's more of employee, employee relations or engagement. But things like the abolition of well, at the moment you have to wait 2 years before you get your employment rights. So they're going to say, well, this is a day one right, but you've also then got, most organizations have probationary periods. How's that going to kind of work? So things like the right to disconnect, statutory sick pay, all those things are the government wants action on, but how it goes about doing that, that's an opportunity for us to influence. In terms of the budget, I would imagine that we will have an announcement of the national minimum and national living wages, which are the minimums that employers have to abide by. So the Low Pay Commission will make its recommendations in the next few weeks, and then Angela Rees will make her announcement on the budget on budget day. What those rates? Well, they'll probably say I'm accepting the recommendations, and then they'll be introduced from April next year. And I think we've also got the Living Wage Foundation, which determines the voluntary living wage, and they are going to be making their announcement about the new rates in the next couple of weeks as well. So there's going to be quite a lot of pay information flying out there.
You can say that again. From the point of view of people who are coming at this as learners, from an era where perhaps they've been more used to the individualization of how reward is managed. Although even with the previous government, we saw a resurgence, certainly in trade union activity and a collectivist approach. It sounds as though some of the previous institutional frameworks are coming back, and legislators as well as employers are going to have to think about that in a slightly different way. As I say, there are only things that for learners coming into reward management that if they've not been socialized to think in more collectivist terms, they could perhaps start wrapping their heads around now. And indeed, are there any sources where, if they want to try to catch up from things that people knew very well in the past, but they need to know looking to the future, that you'd point them towards?
Point them towards your book, Stephen.
Ooh,
uh, you can pay me later. But also the CIPD website, that's got quite a lot of good resources and links from there through to our People Management magazine as well. That kind of gives up news. So if people haven't already, I would suggest that you follow the CIPD on LinkedIn to kind of find out what the latest news is. Sign up for the weekly newsletter. Uh, we're, we're, we're tentatively bringing ourselves onto TikTok. So if you are on TikTok, you can follow the CIPD that way. We've got different approaches. So for instance, if you prefer listening to podcasts, we've got podcasts. If you prefer looking at written details, stuff like that, then we've got blogs and articles. We've also got research reports based on evidence, and so basically it's really up to you. I
that's
suppose
right.
the
I mean,
challenge is that obviously now we have a global audience. We're now having to be more, I suppose, aware that when we write, we do so in a way that people whose first language isn't English can actually understand what we're saying.
yeah, well, I mean, that's absolutely right. As you say, we've all got to be very sensitive to those things. I bring that under the heading of context. As you know, in the book, we've got a subheading of alternatives or strategic
Mm.
choices, consequences that you can try to work out what will follow from your choices managerially. But context, it's that all important context, whether it's the changing world of work or it's the international setting and the need for sensitivity there. I think you've just said that there are lots of contexts in which people can access really valuable information that will help them both with their studies and obviously informing their ongoing practice. Um, could we turn to some of the excellent ideas that you sketched out in the foreword to the new edition of the book? And you talked about future-facing challenges. I think the first one, which was a really interesting point, that there'd been a lot of talk about we need to build back better after the pandemic period, but that you mentioned that CIPD research intelligence was suggesting that so-called business as usual was rather trumping that. Could you say a bit more?
Well, I suppose there were various, I suppose, drivers. One was the unfortunate death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, and we saw some, quite progressive thinking because of that in many workplaces. But then it's kind of petered out, and not a great deal has changed. I mean, we are seeing more organisations because it's not a requirement, a legal requirement at the moment, voluntarily publishing their ethnicity pay gaps and their ethnicity pay plans. But when you look at organisations that don't do it, why? aren't you? And you ask the HR people, and they say, well, there's nobody internally asking for this, there's nobody externally asking for this, and you know the other the other experts, we don't know why we don't do. Nobody's asking us to do this. So it may be that with this government requirement, then that will give the kind of the push that this issue needs to and it needs to focus on, and then start thinking about, well, how are we rewarding people, but not just, as I said earlier, rewarding, but also, recruiting, selecting, managing, developing, promoting, offering flexible working arrangements, etc.
Yeah.
So I mean, that is one example, but yes, I mean, people were talking about um, there's going to be more focus on the front line. I think they had often been forgotten about, and then the pandemic suddenly realised that actually the people who were on frontline workers or key workers actually were the quite, vitally important part of the labour force, vitally important for most organisations. So the question is, for instance, how was that then going to be reflected by the retail sector or the transport sector? And we did see some improvements in their paying conditions, but some of that was due to shortages as well. So people are having to increase rates just to kind of get people in. Um, and if you look at it, it seems that things like benefits have been kind of sacrificed so that more money can be put into pays pay. And if you do get ill, you know the sick pay arrangements may not be brilliant. When you come to retire, the pension arrangements may not be brilliant. Which hopefully we would have thought there may have been more interest in from organisations, but I suppose you've also got from their perspective the competitive pressures, people looking for cheaper prices, especially during the recent cost of living crisis. And whilst inflation isn't increasing by as much as it has in the past, things are still more expensive than they were a few years ago. So lots of people are still struggling financially, and their employee financial well-being is being negatively impacted. And of course, there's research evidence to show that if people are under financial stress, then their performance is not going to be as good as it would have been, which has implications, for the organisation.
One of the things that you said in your forward was using communications to help people think about how they can make better use of the overall reward package that's offered with financial as well as mental and physical well-being in mind.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important, and I think part of the challenge is that reward people and HR people, when they think about communication, they just think about how they would like to communicate or how they would like to communicate it to, which isn't necessarily the same as the rest of the workforce. So you do need to kind of talk to your communications experts, and if you haven't got communications experts in house, and perhaps talking to them outside. Bringing outside expertise, or just talking to other organizations to see how they do it and how they can raise awareness. But behavioral science again gives us good clues into how you can communicate more effectively. So perhaps talk about particular issues when they become salient. So talking about the financial impact of going away on maternity leave makes sense to talk about that when somebody's about to go away on maternity leave. Obviously, there are challenges because, I mean, using the same logic, you would talk about pensions retirement with somebody who's about to go on retirement, but actually, it may be too late then. So you really need to start talking to people earlier on, and that's to a certain extent why automatically enrollment was brought in, just to kind of get people in to to the pension as early as possible, and hopefully by the time come to retirement they'll have a reasonable sized pot. The challenge now is, what do they do with that pot, given that we've got quite a lot of freedom? So the irony is that you didn't have much choice about being in a pension scheme, though you could, perhaps decide to contribute more. It's just that when you come to getting your pension scheme in a defined contribution scenario, you've got you've got lots more choice and decisions, and people may not necessarily be in a position to make the best choices.
That's a really good point. So communications, education, if you like,
Mm,
really crucial. We've talked for a long time in Reward, obviously, about the idea of short, medium, long term when it comes to incentives or recognition arrangements. But actually here, I think from what you're saying, there's a communications short term, medium term, long term that also could quite helpfully be put together. What do people need to do to plan for the long term whilst managing those short term and medium term pressures? And is that something that an organisation that sometimes seems to be ever more arm's length in its relationship with working people, including, as you say, the vital frontline people, there's a bit of a conundrum there in terms of thinking about, well, what's the nature of our relationship? Is it a long-term one? Or are we looking simply to support people through our communications, policies, and education to take control themselves for the medium and long term that may not be with the same organisation, certainly not the old gold watch after 40 years retirement.
yes, it's quite challenging. I mean, especially with the development of recent new technology and AI, what is the world going to be? Because to a certain extent, that's rather the starting point for Reward, is that if you don't know how how jobs are going to be done in the future and how the organization is going to be done in the future, it then can be a bit difficult to say, well, we need a short-term incentive plan, or we need to use this type of approach or that approach, because that might not be appropriate. So, for instance, you could argue that we are moving towards a more, I suppose, team-based approach in terms of how what organizations need to do to be successful. They need their people to be collaborating with one another. So things like shared experience is going to be important. And of course, if that is important, then you don't then want to be sending out mixed messages by having a pay system which rewards and recognizes individual performance. I'm not just saying that's not important, but you do need to think about, well, if we are talking about the importance of collaboration, then we've got to think about how we reward teams and departments and functions for their successes.